Welcome, everyone, to the Project Liberal podcast. I'm your host, Max Marty, and I am joined today by the wonderful founder of Project Liberal and the executive director, Joshua Eakle.
What's up, Max? Good to see you again.
And our guest today is the fabulous Tom Palmer. Tom is an American classical liberal author and theorist, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and vice president for international programs at the Atlas Network. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right. So, Tom, I want to start us off with just a bit of level setting background here. Let's make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to how we're defining liberalism, how we're thinking about this subject from the get-go. So, what is your definition of liberalism? What do you think is a useful one for us to work with?
There are lots of ways to look at a question like this, logically, conceptually, historically, and so on. I think the easiest way to think of it is three elements drawn from three different disciplines that cohere. So from moral philosophy, the idea that individuals have imprescriptible rights. That is to say, they're not gifts from somebody else. The president, the king, the emperor didn't give us our rights. No, possibly God-given, but not from another human being. So we have rights, or as Nozick put it, individuals have rights. There are certain things you may not do to them without violating those rights, those rightful claims. The response of absolutists, of illiberal figures is, well, if you have rights, there'll be chaos. It'll be craziness. Everyone does their own thing. There's no coherence, no social order. And so from social philosophy, we think about economics, sociology, law, and so on, the idea of spontaneous order, that not all the order in life was imposed by someone, visualized by some great mind, a king or a legislator, and then imposed on society. Most of the order emerges spontaneously. Our legal systems, our language, obviously, no one invented English. You'd have to be evil to do that. Well, the irregularities and the weird spellings and so on, only a evil person would invent English. And then this idea that, well, when rights are well-defined and legally respected, then you get a more complex form of social order than anyone could have imposed through violence or coercion. And then you need the third element, which is from law and political science, and that is to say, a set of institutions we can call a constitution, rule of law, various ways to describe it, that help us to define our rights, so I know pretty clearly what's yours and what is mine, and then to enforce them and to allow people to interact peacefully, to exchange property titles, and so on. And so those three elements reinforce each other. Any one of them is incomplete. Finally, looked at historically, think of it as a movement that emerged to defend older principles of the supremacy of law against the newly emergent absolute state, the idea of the state sovereign who claims to be above the law. We're seeing this in Washington, D.C., but it's an old theme. King James the Sixth and First, the Stuart monarch, claimed that as the monarch, I am above the law. I'm the one who gives power to the law, and if the law is inconvenient to me, I just change it. So I'm above the law. And liberalism arises to challenge that and say everyone is subject to the law. We want to be governed by laws and not by men. So historically understood, it's a response to the absolute state that drew on earlier traditions, ideas, and roots going back to Cicero, and very particularly important person, but then radicalized them, formulated them, made them more clear, the ideas of the levelers and John Locke, and later the abolitionists and so on. Everybody has rights. Everybody counts. There's no one born into the world with a saddle on his back and another booted and spurred to ride him, as Richard Rumbold and then later Thomas Jefferson put it.
Was the evolution of liberalism tied at all to technological change or the movement of humans into urban, denser living versus agrarian style living? I mean, what were the drivers, or was it purely just happenstance that we've gotten this kind of evolution of all these concepts?
A complicated question if you're talking about the sweep of thousands of years of human history. Urbanization by itself is not enough, although urbanization was a great step in human civilization. The density of people meant you got more ideas, more possibilities of exchange, and so on. But that's not sufficient. There were urban societies that didn't have strong, robust principles of self-governance or individual liberty or rule of law. I think there are certain accidents that are significant, and one of them is in Europe, the fall of the Roman Empire, which had all kinds of terrible consequences for the people who lived then, but then the decentralization of political order, so that Europe becomes the least centralized political system on the entire Eurasian landmass in comparison to the other great state systems. And that meant that there was a lot of competition among rulers to attract taxpayers. This means that it's more propitious for the emergence of the rule of law because you say, oh, well, we'll respect your rights, we'll tax you less, we won't confiscate as much, we'll grant you more legal protection if you come here. And so that order generated a kind of social system propitious for the emergence of the ideas of liberty. But I don't think even that's sufficient. I'm not a materialist in that way. There are also ideas that matter. And I do think that one of the significant features, we can talk about technology, Gutenberg's introduction of movable type into Europe. It had been done in China earlier, but he came up with it for the Latin alphabet. It meant that the first two books to be published were, one, the Bible, naturally. That means the book. That's the book you would have if you had one book in the Christian civilization at that time. And then the other is On Duties, De Officiis, by Marcus Tullius Cicero. And Cicero is a very important figure, writing at the end of the Roman Republic and struggling to keep the Republic in the face of people who are trying to seize total power for themselves to create what we today would call tyrannies. And he was working to sustain a principle of law and justice. And in it, he makes this remarkable claim. By the way, to circle back to Gutenberg, it's the second most printed book after the Bible. It's extremely important in the formation of political awareness, all the way down through the American Revolution. They all read Cicero, and they get these ideas of rights, of justice. He says that we are all governed by the same law of nature, and if that is true, then we are forbidden to act violently or to harm another person. It's a really quite striking statement that's then quoted repeatedly for thousands of years and becomes embedded in this notion that we are born free, that enslavement and tyranny are in a way unnatural conditions. They're imposed on us. They don't flow out of our nature per se. And that we protect our freedom within a republican system of government, res publica, the public thing, that the system of law is fundamentally owned by all the people. It doesn't belong just to the king or the emperor, as it was articulated in other political thoughts. So Cicero is very important, and he had a big impact on translating these ideas of natural law from the ancient world into the modern world. And then many people, John Locke, I mentioned, is extremely significant in this regard, but he drew on some of the earlier levelers. So Richard Rumbold, I mentioned, but Overton and Walwyn and others who fought for individual rights regardless of religion. This was very important at the time. They believed everyone had rights. Even Irish people had rights. They were English. It's kind of radical view. But if you go to Burford in England, a little shrine to the ideas of liberty, on the church there, you can see where in 1649, levelers were executed for refusing to invade Ireland. And on the baptismal font, you can see scratched in Anthony Sedley, prisoner, 1649. They said, we will not wage cruel war and persecution over matters of conscience, namely that the Irish were Catholic and these men were all Protestants. And as a consequence, they were executed. But they said, we are free from the crowns of our head to the soles of our feet, as Overton put it. I'm a free man, and I cannot be compelled to do an unjust thing. I refuse. And these were very tough people, great, real, we'll call them proto-liberals. They believed in equal rights for everyone, equal rights for women, which was, of course, quite radical at the time as well. regardless of religion, race, and so on. And they believed in freedom of trade and a constitutional order to govern people, to be subjected to the rule of law and not the empire of men, as another great figure, James Harrington, put it.
It
So
sounds to me.
ideas
Oh,
matter.
it sounds to me, Tom. Let me see if I can paraphrase sort of a lot of what you said here. Through a series of strong-willed characters, happenstance, geopolitical factors in Europe, there arose this tradition of liberalism, but it wasn't etched in stone that it would happen that way.
Yes, that's right. I'll
Right.
give you a simple example. I was at a conference years ago, and we on Aristotelian ethics and Confucian ethics. A really interesting uh, set of texts and discussions. And one person who I thought was a little dim said, "Oh, I get it. If you start with Aristotle, you get the American Revolution and the Bill of Rights. If you start with Confucius, you get the Cultural Revolution." And I thought, well, a lot of things happened in between that's really very facile and silly. It's not like that, that it's embedded. Somehow the idea was a seed waiting to flower. There are people who argue this. I don't find it very convincing. The ideas of liberalism, proto-liberalism, can be found in China as well. Think about Lao Tzu and his writings. It's like reading Adam Smith. Really quite remarkable on spontaneous order and the idea of wu wei, active inactivity, set the rules and then stand back and let the order emerge. And the ideas of individuality of Su Tong Po, a great poet, and Mencius, and many others. It wasn't the lacking intellectual foundations. It also needed a kind of context in which these institutions could take root. So liberalism is very much about institutions. And you needed to have those, not just the ideas, for free societies to emerge.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was the modern context of liberalism. So when I think about the caricature that most people have of liberals in American society, and this is not the case in other societies, like I know many countries in Europe don't have the same problem. I don't think about, many Americans don't think about spontaneous order and the rule of law and natural rights when they think about American liberals. Do you have any commentary on just unpacking kind of what happened to the definition of that word in the United States over the last 100 years?
The U.S. is a bit of an outlier in this regard. So in Europe, we use the term liberal to mean what I've just been talking about. This idea of limited government, toleration, equal freedom and rights for everyone, market economy rather than state-dominated and driven, freedom of trade, and so on. That changed in the United States. It's a kind of interesting thing to study. Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist, once said it was the ultimate, if unintended, compliment to the system of free enterprise that its enemies took its name for themselves. So people who were opposed to free enterprise, particularly in the United States, started to call themselves liberals. They saw their view as representing a kind of higher liberty. And I think it was a mistake. And now we're seeing among people who followed that tradition a return to the original uh, uh, roots of liberalism. And I think that Trump is explaining that to them. What happens when the wrong guy gets all the power you have been accumulating? It's a terror. And the view that, don't worry, we'll always be in charge, that didn't happen. And now we have a, how to put it, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I don't want to give a diagnosis, but I think a crazy, unstable person who's vengeful and cruel has all this power. And now people are beginning to have some second thoughts about this. Look at the trade issue. I think that we're seeing now on the center left that had adopted much of this other kind of liberalism is now turning back to free trade as they've seen how it can be used as a weapon for corruption and for venal point scoring and harming your enemies and so on. The doctrine that someone like Thomas Hill Green articulated was that there was a higher liberty and that we would use the state to realize that. You have to educate people to think. They can't think if they haven't been to a state educational system. This, I don't think it's true, but it was a common view. So we're really liberating them. Isaiah Berlin discusses this in his wonderful essay on the two concepts of freedom. And he says the so-called negative and positive. I don't fully endorse his view of the matter, but it's very stimulating. That ultimately the positive doctrine says we're going to make you want the things you really want, the real you. We will liberate you by eliminating all the things that are in the way of you making the choices you really want, ignorance, superstition, and so on. And once we have liberated you, you'll want what you really want. You'll authentically be free. And as he points out, this really is a doctrine, when carried through systematically, of totalitarianism. And I'm gratified to see that many people, such as Cass Sunstein, for example, a very distinguished legal theorist, who's been part of that other American liberalism, has recently said, he's changing his view on this. He had dismissed the so-called classical liberals as interesting, but they were in the way and old-fashioned, and they were so afraid of power. Look at all the good things power can do. Well, now we're seeing again, the lesson of what happens when power is used in this way, and they're starting to wake up. By the way, it was a lesson that had to be learned in the previous century as well. And I fear in some ways we're repeating or recapitulating a process that happened in the early part of the 20th century up to the middle part.
Why, Tom, why is it that we're seeing illiberalism of this sort kind of rearing its ugly head to the extent that it is now? Does this have to do with the technological changes that we're seeing, social media, whatever, that has finally accumulated enough steam to change culture in some fundamental ways? Is it the geopolitics, that the pressure that Putin and Russia are putting on, have been doing behind the scenes to undermine American culture and exceptionalism or whatever, or bad luck, or what is it that right now? I know you had a panel at the recent Liberalism in the 21st Century conference called "The Philosophical Roots of Illiberal Movements," but those illiberal movements have been around forever. I mean, I think one of the clear conclusions is a lot of the stuff that's being put out now is not necessarily new, right? These are old ideas being rehashed and put in a different framing. So why are they suddenly gaining so much traction and so much power so quickly? Or is that an illusion? Does it just seem that way?
No, I think it is happening. And let me state at the outset, I think there's some things we can say as social scientists, political scientists, economists, that are predictions that are likely to be true. If you abolish private property, the means of production, and make it illegal for people to exchange and eliminate property rights in farms, people will eat each other. We have seen that happen now repeatedly. When they did that in communist countries, you ended up with starvation and cannibalism in Ukraine and in China. But I don't think that most political things are like that they're so easily predictable. So we have a confluence of a number of bad luck, but a lot of bad things happening at the same time. So let's run through a couple of them. One, I'm being visited by one of my feline research assistants, so if she interrupts, I apologize. One is a move in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I was there and was very active in the Soviet Union and Soviet countries with friends promoting liberal ideas. And we said, this is fantastic. It really was. And for some time, it looked like things were going to go well. Here we go. This is Apple. Come here, sweetheart. Here we go.
She's the good luck of, we're talking about bad luck, but she's bringing the good luck.
Oh, my black cats bring good luck. And then Putin, who was a KGB man, managed to take over the state. And he then realized when oil prices went up so high, I don't need rule of law. I've got oil money. And he began to institute a very strong collectivist state. They call it in Russian the strong hand, which he then took over the entire state, everything. And there, by the way, there's a blueprint that's being recapitulated in the United States at an accelerated rate. Take over the tax authorities, take over all the armed forces of the state, all the people with guns. So the people in Russia who wield real power are not the oligarchs. This is a common mistake. Oligarchs are not that important in Russia, the big businessmen with all the privileges. It's the siloviki, the men of force, the people who run the army, the armed forces, the interior ministry troops, the FSB, the military intelligence. Those are the people who have power. And Putin is coordinating and riding above all of them. It ended up with this state then promoting the ideas basically of the Third Reich. And I'm very serious about that. Carl Schmitt, very much in vogue. Alexander Dugin, who is a very strange intellectual figure in Russia, he's inaccurately called Putin's brain and so on. This is not true. But he was extremely influential in promoting the reemergence of the Russian Empire. And he has channeled all these ideas of the Third Reich into contemporary language. He has the support of a very, very important wealthy person, Konstantin Malafeyev, who's more or less the banker to Putin, who sponsors him. So they began to pump out this really fascist and neo-Nazi literature again. Then you had in the United States a freaky accident. If you go back to 2015, you had 17 Republican presidential candidates, 15 members of Congress, governors, senators. They're like them or not, they're normal people within the context of democratic politics. And then a quirky brain scientist, very clever but somewhat odd views, and a reality TV star who's very good at dominating every room he's in. And that's what happened. He sucked up all the media attention and swept in. Totally bizarre. Not a Republican. He was a lifelong Democrat. He's a man of no principles. And he realized, if I'm more nationalist and more ugly and more ignorant than anyone else, I can get enough votes to win. And he did once. Then he lost. Now he's won again. The third time, an honest victory, but I think a loss for freedom, all things considered. And that was just kind of a freak accident. I don't think he would have predicted that in 2015. It was not inevitable, but it did happen. The other thing that's worth looking at, Karen Stenner has written extensively on authoritarianism. She's a political psychologist, really interesting writer. And she talks about how threats bring out what she calls authoritarian groupiness. And she makes the following claim, which I think is very interesting and well supported. There's not something called the fascist personality, which was a theory that was bandied about after the Second World War. What explained fascism? Well, there's this fascist personality, and they got power. She basically points out, that's in all of us. We all have that capacity to circle the wagons, to be collectivist, to keep out the outsider when we're threatened. Number one, an existential threat. When the enemy is going to take us over, we naturally form little collective or very big collective tribes to defend ourselves. So war usually drives collectivism. But second, a threat to your status. And this is something liberals need to think about more systematically. We have, and whatever kind of liberal you want to say, believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, as John Kennedy put it very elegantly, right? That you might get richer faster than I do, but we're all getting richer. So why should I be so upset about you doing better off than I am? I'm getting much better off than I was before, than my parents were, and so on. But we are very attentive to our ranking in the hierarchy. So if we order from the most popular to the least popular, let's say Max is the most popular person here, Joshua's the second, I'm the third, I'm the least popular. If I rise in the ranking, someone has to fall. Josh has to fall. He goes from second to third, and he doesn't like that. We don't like feeling that our status, our relative status, has gone down. And the consequence of this is that we've seen rapid changes in society. So women rose in status, or women ran for president, you had secretaries of state, leaders of big corporations, and so on. Black people, African-American president, that's kind of the peak of the political pyramid right up there with President Obama. Muslims, no one had seen a Muslim in the United States 50 years ago. Now your doctor and your the person down the street, the family around the corner, they're Muslims. So they rose in social status. Well, somebody had to fall. If it's ranked from 1 to 100, and the number 100, the lowest, goes up, somebody fall. Even if their actual condition has improved. And let's look at the people who tend to vote the hardcore MAGA, not the ones at the periphery, but the hardcore. White men who did not go to college, so a high school degree or less. They're richer than their dads were and their granddads. They have more stuff. They live longer. The medical care is better. They travel more. They fly. When I was a boy, we didn't fly any place. You got in a car and drove. Now people don't think much about flying long distances. So that their status, their well-being has improved, but their relative status fell. And many people don't like that. We found that in other countries as well. So that threats to my relative status brought about by very rapid change seems to produce, again, what Center calls authoritarian groupiness, this idea that we need a leader to protect us from them, the M&Ms, the Mexicans and the Muslims, or whatever the outgroup is that we want to keep out.
It seems to me like the status change happened, like you were saying, so quickly, right? There's so many of these different groups. LGBT is another one you didn't mention. There's a lot of groups that rose in status relative to the average MAGA voter in that circumstance.
Well, and to add to that too, Max, this is something that I think we spoke to Shika Dalmi about when we had her on the show last year. And I'm curious as to how you react to this, Tom. It almost feels to me like if you embrace the core principles of liberalism, so it leads to economic dynamism and disruption. It leads to expansion of rights, and as you said, the rise of maybe marginalized groups into more prominent positions in society. It almost feels like liberalism creates the conditions in and of itself for that kind of emotional reaction to it. And I'm curious as to whether you agree with that characterization. Like liberalism almost if you embrace it, it creates pushback against itself just by the nature of how liberalism operates.
This was a thesis that was advanced by Joseph Schumpeter, whom I mentioned. He's a very interesting, thoughtful economist and sociologist, and he argued that capitalism, as it was called, so market economy, generates so much wealth, it can generate an intellectual class that resents their position in society. So he focused mainly on the intellectuals. And they look out there and they say, I have 3 college degrees. I'm an important person. And that person over there cuts down trees for a living and makes more money than I do, has a nicer house. And they don't like that. And so his argument was that it generated a class of intellectuals, professors and writers and so on. So that kind of a group that we're more or less in, I think, but most of whom resent the fact that they're not as prominent as they ought to be. Robert Nozick wrote an essay on this theme also, and he suggested that intellectuals tended to be opposed to the market economy in the contemporary time because they were the kids who did the best in class, right? They're the ones who got the gold star. I don't know what they do now with kids get something on their iPad or something. When I was a little boy, you got a gold star for doing a good job on your mathematics. And they always got the gold stars and always were praised by the teachers. Then they got out into the big world, and it's that nerdy weirdo in the back who becomes a trillionaire or a billionaire, right? Those people are losers, man. They were social misfits. Well, they got rich through computer work and all of those IT and everything. And the ones who then went into the professoriate, they really resent that. Why should those ignorant misfits be rich and I'm not? Now, of course, they are rich. Intellectuals tend to have high incomes compared again to their predecessors, certainly, but they compare themselves to the tech billionaires. They say, why has that guy got all that money? And some of them, Bill Gates didn't go to college. He doesn't have a college degree, and that angers them. And so that was Nozick's thesis that I think has a lot of salience. Then there are other issues about social resentment. It's so easy to do two things, if you think about it psychologically. Blame other people for my problems. That's perfectly natural, and I think all of us have had that experience. And we tried to correct ourselves, say, no, this is on me. I did this. I can't blame other people. But then also to define yourself by what you're not. And this is something that comes out with racism and forms of homophobia that I think are common. I don't want to say they're natural, but they're certainly quite common. I say, well, at least I'm not a queer, right? So I might not have much in the way of accomplishment. That other person over there was homosexual. I can denigrate that person, even though that person accomplished something I didn't. I'm still better. And this, of course, was a core of racism, that a person could look at someone else of accomplishment, a medical doctor or an entrepreneur, and say, yeah, well, at least I'm not black like that guy is. I'm better than that person because of what? Something I didn't do, I didn't accomplish it. So you can erase the accomplishments of others by drawing on some other form of identity. You identify yourself by what you're not. This is really a common human experience, and I think it's one of the drivers of illiberalism.
Tom, can I add a little bit? Can I add one more point to this? I want to shove technology back into here, kicking and screaming. But I think comparative status salience has been amplified by the fact that in the past, people would compare themselves to those on their block, maybe those at their workplace or in their church or some other kind of local community, because they all, they would turn on the TV and maybe they'd see lifestyles of the rich and famous or whatever, and late at night or some celebrity thing. But nowadays we're so online, and especially average people. I mean, many of us have been online for 30 years, but average people are now really, really online, and they're online in these, TikToks and social media, where that is what the status comparison they're living for the majority of the time of the day, rather than what's actually happening in the neighborhood around them. And I think that just throwing it in your face to that extent, that constantly is very important, just as important as the actual change in those status hierarchies has been.
Maybe. I mean, I'll be frank, I'm a little skeptical of that. And there might be a lot to it. I think it may put it in some context. The fragmentation of social media, the lack of reputation, and now it's going to get worse with AI. You can't tell if something is really someone being interviewed or not. Is it totally fake? Is it made up? It has a hugely disruptive effect with lots of negative effects. Think about the introduction of the printing press. Wasn't that amazing? Growth of knowledge. Well, it also did lead to 150 years of religious conflict and mass murders in Europe, because now the Bible was printed and everyone could argue about what it meant and how to take the Eucharist and so on. And it had that unfortunate side effect of generating civil war that people forgot about. They only think about all the good things that come from books. So every new technology has its disruption. The book itself was disruptive. I mean, read what you find in Plato about how terrible books are. People won't remember things. They won't think because it's all written down in a book. And I think we're going through that again, and there will be bad consequences and good. It may be leading to more social anxiety. This is something that's, I think, plausible, especially among teenagers, that they see everyone else. The girls see the other girls look better, prettier, nicer hair. The boys see the other boys are more fit and buff, and sometimes AI enhanced. and that might generate feelings of insecurity. But I don't think that that's the most important element. And we'll come back to this idea of ideas. There are a lot of things that happen that influence each other, but a lot of the world is made up of accidents. Some things happened that no one would have predicted. Europe was not overrun by the Mongols because on December 12, 1241, Ogadai Khan was poisoned. After defeating the Hungarian knights, he was about to charge. He would have gone all the way to the English Channel. And he was poisoned, and all the Khans went back to Karakoram to elect a new Khan. And Europe was saved. It's a freaky accident. So there's a lot of that, but ideas do matter. And we've seen this reemergence of the ideas of what was called the conservative revolution. That's, I think, worth spending a little bit of time on, because these ideas, this populist movement really has an intellectual heritage. There were thinkers, Carl Schmitt, notable among them, but Martin Heidegger, Benito Mussolini. These were intellectuals. And they were intellectuals who hated liberalism, really passionately hated liberalism. And they wrote passionately against liberalism, and these ideas are being recycled. Listen to Trump's speeches. Even Trump's rants and meanderings are redolent of these earlier anti-liberal writings. So Carl Schmitt's book on parliamentarism, his attack on deliberative government, it's all just empty talk. They just talk, but what's really happening is the Jews and the other special interests behind the scenes rigging the game against us. Well, this is the kind of discourse we have right now. We need a strong leader instead. We need a dictator, cut through all the crap. The idea, and here I think that it's been a mistake for people to denigrate politics as such for a long time. Tatbo threw all the bastards out. The notion that people who run for political office show a character defect, I think is a big mistake, because what we saw earlier, like Thomas Mann articulated this in his book on the considerations of an unpolitical man, that they retreat from politics and say, well, we'll let it be an authoritarian state. I'm going to retreat into my private world. This is a big mistake. We need to be politically engaged. If you don't engage politically, you will lose your freedom. It's not an automatic machine that just replicates itself. It needs us to be involved. This idea that action for the sake of action is preferable to deliberation and reason and expertise. The idea that there was a golden age of unity, people had purpose and meaning and a place, and everything was orderly and people loved each other. And now it's fragmented, and we have all this disagreement that's caused by liberalism. You hear this repeatedly. Someone like Patrick Deneen, who is a political theorist, and he has this view that the ancient Greeks had this life of virtue that permeated their political life. It's one of the few occasions I burst into laughter reading a book. He said he wrote, the ancient Greeks believed. I said, really? All of them? This is one of the dumbest things I'd read in a long time. What he meant was Plato believed. And the fact that Plato was attacking other people who didn't believe that should have told him the ancient Greeks didn't believe that. Plato believed that. The people who have this view, which is very common, that there was an earlier era, the 1950s America or 1840s or whatever time, when you had this organic whole that was integrated, everyone knew their place, and there wasn't all this predatory behavior, it's all bullshit. It's all phony. Those eras were full of contention, disputation, predatory behavior, and so on. This disputation isn't caused by liberalism. What liberalism does is it changes violent attacks on each other into debate. It changes looting into exchange. If I want what you have, I could come and beat you up and take it, or I could offer you something you want more. And liberalism is about changing oppression and violence into conversation and discussion, and looting into exchange. But this view that pre-liberal societies were all wonderful and orderly, or that contemporary peasant societies are utter fantasies. And I don't take people seriously who believe these things. Last point, the ones who believe that peasant societies, everyone loves each other and they're all organic, they've never met any people in peasant societies. I've lived in poor rural communities, and let me tell you, they're just as predatory and more so than people in big urban agglomerations. It's just a fantasy of intellectuals to think, oh, those people are all peaceful and harmonious. And that's what we need. That's what we're yearning for. And what will we do? We'll have a dictator or a all-powerful state to create that organic unity. Never happen.
I would want to say one thing about AI, which has been somewhat maligned in your response, but I think it gives people in those peasant societies the chance to learn and study all of these great ideas and these great thinkers that of the liberal tradition, to an extent to which, if their alternative is to be spending a bunch of time on social media, that's definitely not going to be nearly as helpful, I think, as AI. And yes, AI can create a bunch of fake garbage, but if you look at, for example, Grok, which is built and developed and residing within the belly of the beast, that one of the major uses of Grok is whenever somebody tweets some ridiculous concept to say, "Hey, Grok, is this true?" And then Grok basically usually says, "No, it's not." Josh does this all the time. His great, very viral tweets that just asking Grok, "Hey, is this true?" So I'm very bullish on AI's potentially positive effects. Um, I wanted to take us in a slightly different. I would ask a slightly different question. It seems to me like, from my perspective, illiberalism looks very similar when you go down the road far enough. So whether you're in a theocratic, authoritarian society, or a kleptocracy, or a communist state, or a fascist state, or any of these things, they all like to do sort of a handful of similar things. They restrict what you can say, what you can do. They tell you what to do. They tell you how to, who you can marry, or how you can, all of these different things. They try to control you to a very strong extent. They give you a set of enemies that you really must hate, and, etc. Now, is that I just, I'm not a wine connoisseur, so all wines, in fact, I don't even like wine. So all wine to me tastes kind of bad, right? But of course, somebody who is a wine connoisseur would say, "Oh, that's because you don't have the fine distinctions in taste to really see how they actually are really, really different, and the differences are enormously important." So is it just that I'm a liberal and thus I can't see, I can't, I don't care, or I lose the fine-grained distinctions that genuinely deeply matter between these forms of illiberalism, or are there real differences between these?
Yeah, of course there are real differences, but there are also real commonalities, and you've focused on the commonalities. Having an enemy is very convenient for maintaining a dictatorship, controlling speech, and so on. But there are important differences in ideologies. So the Islamic Republic and the supreme leader, they have a particular ideology that leads them to beat women to death for not covering their hair and execute homosexuals and so on. The Russian state has its ideology also of violence and brutality and expansionism, and everyone should owe us something. We brought civilization into the world, and they owe us, and they need to obey us. The Chinese Communist Party is a bit different. I don't think it has quite the same expansionist global view, although it is expansionist locally, certainly with regard to Taiwan. But there are differences. On the other hand, there are very important commonalities. And one of the things that I think is important is to realize that the ideology is rarely upheld as a matter of firm belief by the leaders of those states. These are tools for power. What they want is power and money, and all the stuff you can get with power and money, right? Sex, houses, prestige, obedience, all those things that normally powerful males want in life. And so these states, North Korea, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Iran, and Hungary, which is the still in the European Union, but very much in this orbit, they all cooperate. So they have ideologies that seem to be at odds with each other. Communist Party in China, Russian traditionalism, Orban's traditional Hungarian nationalist mentality, and so on. What do they have in common? Money and power. So Anne Applebaum wrote a very good short book, Autocracy Incorporated, and she just really began to scratch the surface. The reason is most of their activities are deliberately hidden from us. Money transfers, all of the staggering arms flows among these states. They don't put these on the newspapers or announce them. But she did a very good job of scratching the surface to show what's happening. It's about money and power. And that's one of the reasons why these rulers are so dangerous. There are no moral limits to them. If you're threatening their money, they will come after you. And there's nothing they wouldn't do if they really felt that you were a threat to their hold on power and money. So to give you one interesting recent example, Viktor Orban is a very corrupt figure in Hungary who has turned Hungary into a largely one-party state. Because they're still in European Union, there's a slim chance that there might be a free election coming up and the opposition might actually win now that they have a new, more energetic opposition leader. He was the only vote in the European Union to veto the condemnation of Maduro's theft of the election in Venezuela. Why would Hungary do that? Like, what's the big Hungarian interest in Venezuelan politics? He got a phone call basically from Putin, his boss, who said, don't let that happen. Venezuela is an important part in this global network of illiberal states who engage in narco trafficking, money laundering, arms trading, and so on, amongst all of them. So Iran is an important figure. Hezbollah, which is active in Latin America also, is a front for Iran, and they're very heavily involved in narco trafficking, as was the Assad regime. So it's a complex of states that use ideology to control their populations, but they don't believe it. The leaders do not believe any of this. It is all about keeping themselves in power.
Okay, well,
And
Josh,
that's why your point,
yeah.
there's a despot's handbook that they share amongst themselves. Here are the things you need to do to cement power. And now we're seeing it being used in the United States, and it's going to be used, unfortunately, now in Slovakia, I'm afraid, and possibly other or European Union countries. The Russians are so active in election interference and promoting far left and far right parties. They love both of them. Both of these extremist groups who are opposed to liberalism, opposed to the idea of living together peacefully, are sponsored by the Kremlin. And they have a playbook. What happens once you get in power? You make sure you never lose it. And I'm afraid, again, this is happening in the United States. Control of the electoral machinery, control of the tax authorities, which means anyone who challenges the president is going to have tax problems immediately. Control of law firms, control of lawyers. We saw what happened with law firms being attacked and shaken down, told that their lawyers may not enter government buildings. How can you be a lawyer if you can't enter a government building? So all of these things are now being deployed in democratic countries, most notably, and it just really is painful to see in the United States.
One benefit, though, Tom, of all these things that we're seeing, of all the connections between all of these different agents, is it makes it painfully obvious what side groups are on, right? So because they're all hanging out in the same space and they're all helping each other out. So when you see different countries and different people banding together with North Korea or Russia or China, et cetera, it should be pretty obvious, what the reaction should be from liberals.
This idea of what was called the conservative revolution, a set of illiberal ideas that emerges primarily in Germany, but also has followers in other countries, and that paved the way for National Socialism and dictatorship. Some of whom later regretted it, by the way. So it's not that they were all Nazis, but most of them did become Nazis. Carl Schmitt is a very prominent example. One of them was a man named Hermann Rauschning, And he left early on. So by 1935, he left National Socialism. He said, oh my God, this is not what I had in mind. And then spent years warning the world about this nightmare. He wrote book after book, a very good book on the revolution of nihilism. He pointed out these so-called conservatives were nihilists. They don't believe in anything other than power, domination, violence. There's not some ancient tradition that they're preserving. And look in the United States, trashing the Constitution, trashing the rule of law, denigrating real American history like abolitionism and the civil rights movement, which were about realizing the American principles, all denigrated. Their view was we invent the principles we want to invent as an act of will, and then we will conserve them. So they were revolutionaries. And Rauschning was involved in this movement. He wrote a book explaining it, 1941. It came out in English. And he said something very interesting. He talked of the path along which we came to the single party was that which made National Socialism appear to us to be not entirely repulsive, and which suggested to us that it might contain material which could be so shaped as in the end to provide us with a really practicable new solution. It was a mistake, and indeed a fatal one. But was it so reprehensible or even so stupid as it is usually represented in democratic quarters? So he asked this question in 1941, and maybe it's a fair question at that time, but not anymore. Now we know where these ideas lead. It's absolutely clear that they lead to a horror, the destruction of our freedom, pitting one neighbor against another, the replacement of national harmony by hatred. They talk about a harmonious society. What they want is to drive us to hate our neighbors, to hate the people who are across the street, Republicans to hate Democrats and vice versa, black and white, all of those forms of hatred. Right now, they're obsessed with transgender people. There's a tiny minority in the country, but suddenly they're the fault of all the problems. They want to deny transgender people the right to have guns. It's insanity. This is a set of ideas that have been unleashed on us again by people who know what they're doing. Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, these people know these ideas. Bannon quotes Julius Evola, one of the extreme fascist leaders. He was so extreme, Mussolini considered him a dangerous kook, to give you an idea of what a lunatic he was. He wanted a fascism of pure violence, and this is Steve Bannon's guy. So they're recycling these ideas, and we need to wake up and see where they're leading us, because they do not lead to someplace any of us should want to be. I hope people start to wake up, and those people who have gone along so far thinking, well, yeah, the Democrats are a problem, and I agree with that, right? There's all kinds of problems in the Democratic Party and blah, 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 blah. This has got to be better. And I think that they need to wake up and say, better to have bad politics within normal parameters than to throw everything into the rubbish bin and destroy and trash our Constitution, which is what's happening.
You have actually already gone down the path that I was going to ask you next, but this is something that Max and I have spent a lot of time discussing. I mean, I'm of the opinion that if we're in a moment where, maybe early 2000s Russia, where we're seeing the rise of an actual authoritarian, then the response to anyone that has a commitment to liberalism should be to link arms with people, even if, say, we have differences on economic policy. I'm voting Democrat for the first time in my life in this moment. And Max, I think, has those concerns, and maybe you could speak to those better than I could, but related to, hey, the Democrats in a way helped create the conditions that kind of led to this. So, there's a lot of skepticism. So we don't know the path forward. I think that we have to react very strongly in this moment and move against them. But that was the big question that I wanted to end us with in the last 10 minutes or so that we have, which is, what do you think tactically liberals should do in this moment? It may be not a political strategy, maybe it's a rhetorical strategy, but what do you see the path forward is for us?
I think that heightening or accentuating polarization is the wrong thing to do. it's very important, in my opinion, to reach out to people who have been, let's say, supportive of the current trend and speak to them in a sympathetic way to say, is this really where you want to go? It was Republicans who denied Trump in 2020 his victory. Look at the election results. It wasn't because of a rise in Democratic areas. It was because his margin of victory fell in safely Republican areas. People who said, I'm not going to do this again. So I don't want to be too political about this, one candidate's better than the other. But I think that it's very important to talk to people as citizens and to avoid the polarization. And that means of not insulting people. When people go out and mock or make fun, it's one thing to make fun of a politician. I'm pretty tolerant of that. But making fun of voters, I think, is a terrible mistake. And portraying them as ignorant, stupid, and so on, as some people sometimes do, is wrong. It will blow up. It's disrespectful. It's not part of a free democratic order to treat our fellow citizens that way. And I think we need to respectfully address people and say that this is not going to turn out the way that you thought. And I'm hoping, for my own view, is divided government would be a good thing to come about. That generally works out better than one party controlling both the Congress and the presidency. And particularly at present, I think divided government would be a very good palliative to the current trend. Restore this idea of checks and balances. And that, by the way, is something they reject root and branch. They hate the idea of checks and balances. And if you want to watch a scary podcast, look at the deputy director of the FBI, who's a podcaster. And he says, checks and balances, rule of law. No way, man. We want power. Power. That's very dramatic. But this was a summation of his view. The FBI is now in their grip, and they will use it as power. And all the American tradition will be thrown out. So my view, they are the ones who are un-American, unpatriotic, who trash the Constitution and the American heritage. And people should stand up to them and say, we are patriots. And because we are patriots, we believe in our Constitution, not your dictatorship.
There was a writer who I follow, and I think he often has very good things. He often writes very well. His name is Jeremiah Johnson, and he recently wrote a piece where he argued, and I'm paraphrasing, hopefully I'm getting this right, it was several weeks back, but the Democrats lost sight of the fact that politics is all about power, and they need to recapture that feeling and just do everything they can to get power, hold power, and think of things in a power first dynamic, and get people to embrace the idea of wanting and holding power. And for whatever reason, I really strongly recoiled at that. Partly because I think
find that repugnant.
right. And I also think that the left for a long time was all about power. I mean, there's writers the whole postmodern thing, well, truth is in the eye of the beholder, whatever. So it's all about these power dynamics and how you describe power and who's on top and who's on bottom, who's the victim, who's the oppressor. So I really want to push against that. But I can understand from a tactical perspective how if you just think about things in terms of power, it might actually help you get into power more. How do we walk that fine line in this?
That's very well put. I think that we need to encourage people to re-embrace the civic life and not to retreat from it. So Benjamin Constant, to be a little esoteric for a moment, a very great essay he wrote on the liberty of the ancients contrasted to that of the moderns. It's really about the French Revolution. He gave it, I think it was 1814. There's private liberty. There's modern liberty, which is run your own life as you want, and ancient liberty, being in the republic, but being subordinated to the republic itself. And he says, look, if you totally lose the ancient liberty and say, I'll just retreat into my private life and not worry about it, you won't keep that freedom. You must be engaged in the civic order and the civic life. And I think what we need is a resurrection of civic education, of the idea that it is my obligation to vote, maybe even to run for office if I think I can do a better job. And that means people who are good at that kind of thing, people who are friendly and outgoing, people who like to meet other people, if they have liberal values, they should get into politics. Some of us are not as good at that, going and kissing babies and shaking hands and being nice to everyone. It's very tiring work, and some people are better than others. Those who are good at it should go out and run for office and then do that work of making connections and being friendly to people and say, you can trust me, vote for me. This is my platform, limited government, toleration, freedom of speech, respect for the rule of law, and so on, and maybe some particular things that are from that district, and stand up for our Constitution. And I think it can be done. And I think that there is a substantial constituency in the American polity that will respond positively to that. They're out there, and they need to have people coming and talking to them who don't sound shrill. This is a big problem. Who don't trash America, like unfortunately many people on the further edges of the left have done that. American history is only slavery, Jim Crow laws, oppression, and so on. That is included in American history, and it should not be erased, as the Trump administration is trying to do. But we should also take pride in the American Revolution and setting up for a constitutional order, in the abolition of slavery, which was done by Americans and all those people who fought to get rid of it, in the civil rights movement, and the people who were inspired by the Declaration of Independence and by those principles to stand up for the rights of themselves and their fellow citizens. Embrace that and say, we believe in American patriotism. To be an American isn't to be a color or a religion. It's to believe in a creed. Last point, J.D. Vance articulated so clearly the anti-liberal view when he said America is not an idea. It's a community of shared experience. That's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. America is an idea, the idea that everyone can live freely without being afraid of one another. It's not this organic community of shared experience, which means people who live together for hundreds of years. Jack Posobiec, one of these fascist writers, recently put up a thing about degrees of American heritage. Someone mocked him, said, oh, the Posobiecs of the Mayflower Posobiecs who came over. I don't know when his family came over. It wasn't on the Mayflower. But that's this view, is this organic, derived community of common experience. It's not. Someone who came in 1970 from China or Ethiopia and embraced being American, or 1980 or 1990 or 2000 or 2020, that person is an American, much more than the neo-fascists who deny the American idea and say, no, it's this organic community of white people. This is the subtext usually in that. They, in my opinion, are the ones who have rejected America. And it's the person who came and said, I want to live by these principles. I was born in this country. I came here. I chose to be an American because of that. To me, that person is more an American than J.D. Vance will ever be.
That's a good point for us to be winding down. Josh, did you wanna?
No, I think that's a great place for us to end. I appreciate your time, Tom, and your voice. We usually ask guests before we end the show where they can find you, what you'd recommend them go look up. So, floor is yours if you want to tell our audience whether they want to go learn more about you or your.
Well, I don't know if you can hear my cats are running around and howling. I don't know if it's being picked up. So whenever you hear the cats howling, come there. But I'm easily found on the internet. So Tom G. Palmer. I'm not an Australian rugby player or an American country western singer. I'm generally the other guy. There's some other Tom Palmers out there, but you can usually find me pretty easily on a website or another. And I've written a number of things, that many of which are online, and people might enjoy them or not. It might stimulate someone to think about these things. And in my opinion, we need a civic revival, and it is an intellectual transformation and a moral transformation at the same time. It's hard to separate the two. Understand the ideas of liberty, which I've dedicated my life, and then embrace them as a life project. So I'll give you a quote to end with. A great hero of mine, Joaquim Nabuco, who was an abolitionist in Brazil, helped to abolish slavery. And in his great book published a few years before the abolition, which happened in 1888, he said, "Educate your children and educate yourselves in the love for the freedom of others, for only then will you truly appreciate your own and not see it merely as a gratuitous gift from fate." In other words, people in his day looked out and said, "Oh, I'm free. That's awesome. They're slaves." He said, to understand and appreciate your own freedom, you should love the freedom of those enslaved people. Then you will appreciate you're just not lucky, but you have something that is precious, and they should have it too. To me, that summarizes the idea of liberalism.
And now is the time to fight for that liberalism. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for joining us. Josh, as always. This has been the Project Liberal podcast. Project Liberal is dedicated to advancing the cause of a free and open society. And if you want to become a member, you can join us at projectliberal.org/member. And of course, stay tuned for more episodes of the Project Liberal podcast in the future. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you.